Spider-Man Homecoming is the 16th addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe and brings with it some good stuff, some not so good stuff, and some outright confusing stuff. I wouldn't call it the worst movie in the MCU, mainly because I've done that already, but I certainly wouldn't call it the best. It's full of errors and inconsistencies, but as a longtime Spider-Man fan, I still found plenty to enjoy. This critique, unlike my last one, has no greater purpose besides the criticism itself. I'm not going to criticize the movie and simultaneously try to convince you that it is the worst or best anything. No, this time I'm just going to level my criticism, most of which is negative, and let you draw your own conclusions. Same with my last video. If you agree, disagree, or feel that I missed crucial points, please let me know in the comments section. I love discussion and debate, and that's enough of that. On with the video. In the interest of not repeating myself and not making this video needlessly longer, I'm going to keep the plot criticisms to only essential points that don't fit into any other category in the video. Let's go. Homecoming gives us a new perspective on Peter's role in the airport fight in Civil War, but the same events that are depicted in Civil War and in Peter's vlog are very different depending on which movie you're watching. As Spidey lands after webbing Cap's hands and stealing his shield, he has a dialogue with the characters present before saying,
"Hey everyone,
good job."
But in Homecoming, Peter's phone camera shows him taking Cap's shield and greeting everyone immediately as he lands. The dialogue is missing. We could give the editing team the benefit of the doubt and assume that this is just an editing choice, to include the audio from later on in video present to create effect. I have no problem giving the editors leeway here because the cut happened so fast that Peter saying that line early might have been edited intentionally, but the next inconsistency makes me rethink this judgment. Amid the chaos, Peter chooses to vlog some more and reacts, with camera in hand, to Ant-Man becoming giant before immediately going to join the action again. In Civil War, Peter's reaction to the same event is completely different.
holy shit!
His line totally changed, and now there's a camera in his hand. We no longer have to give the editors the benefit of the doubt because it seems they are fine with rewriting events to serve their own narrative whenever it suits them. We could write this off as the editors intentionally changing established events for their own purposes, but I think the most likely reason that these inconsistencies exist is that the teams behind Homecoming and Civil War simply did not communicate enough. In which case, these errors are outright lazy. This could easily be considered a nitpick, but that's why I left it out of the continuity section of the video. In his personal life, Peter uses the Stark internship as an excuse for his Spidey activities outside of school. When does he get time for homework and friends? The Stark internship is clearly interfering with Peter's extracurricular activities. He has already quit marching band and robotics lab. Wouldn't some people grow suspicious? Like actually suspicious, not curious as Michelle gets. Peter's interaction with Mr. Delmar is pleasant. He clearly frequents the bodega, and yet Mr. Delmar only now learns that Peter can speak Spanish. Spidey foils a bike theft, and bystanders seem totally indifferent to a literal superhero in their presence. Is this the impact of Spidey existing in a world already populated by more famous superheroes? Peter's poor placement of his backpack in this alleyway leads to it getting stolen. This, in turn, leads to him sneaking into his own room and Ned discovering his alter ego. Remember this event. It is the catalyst for many essential plot points to follow. Peter lives with his Aunt May in an apartment building, but not the same one from Civil War. Peter claims that he cannot let May find out about his being Spider-Man because of everything that's happened with her. He likely means the death of Uncle Ben, but that was a strange way of phrasing it. Why is only May suffering? Doesn't Uncle Ben's death carry any weight with Peter? Peter only became Spider-Man within the past year, so Uncle Ben must have died around the same time. Unless the MCU is taking Spidey's origin in a new direction. This leaves room for a new, previously unexplored trauma to be explained in later movies. Michelle is clearly not reading that book. Ned makes a hilarious self-aware reference to other action movies in the archetype of the guy in the chair. After hearing some girls crushing on Spider-Man in gym class, Ned yells out that Peter knows Spider-Man and the whole gym goes quiet. This makes me cringe every time I watch the movie. Ned is made out to be a lovable goofball, and up until this moment in the movie, it's believable. We've all known awkward and lovable people in high school, but Ned takes that to a whole new level. The movie expects us to believe that someone would actually say this in a crowded gym in response to a hot girl fawning over Spider-Man. It's ridiculous. It seems that the only reason this even happened was to give Liz some reason to invite Peter to her party that night. A character doing something stupid to push the plot forward? That's not Marvel's style. Pete covers for Ned's brain fart by using the Stark internship as an excuse, and the dialogue that follows is so clunky it only reinforces the idea that the writers just needed something to happen for Liz to invite Peter to her party. Everything that Peter says just makes him seem more suspect. Ned could have easily just blown Peter's cover, but nobody bats an eye, and Peter shirks it off because Ned convinces him that he has a chance with a senior girl. This is beyond reckless. That night, Peter is even wearing the suit under his clothes, to which Ned responds, "This is going to change our lives." You might think I'd hate this line because of how irresponsible it is, but keep this in mind. This is Spider-Tom's first solo feature. He's only been Spider-Man for a few months and is still learning to cope with balancing his social and super lives. We don't know if Peter tried out wrestling after getting his powers, so we don't know if Peter has yet tried to abuse his powers and learned a valuable lesson from it. His bringing the suit to a party to impress a girl and deciding against it is necessary character development, and I'm glad the writers handled it this way. However, the fact that Ned's loud mouth and stupidity got them to this point remains poor writing. Alternatively, Liz could have held a small social exclusively for the debate team members and mentioned that she likes Spider-Man at one of the practices. Aside, Peter tells Ned that Liz likes Spidey. Ned suggests that Peter uses his suit to impress Liz at the social. Peter eventually decides against it. Boom. Character development. Not only would that have been sensible, it wouldn't have been awkward as hell. This is the third time Michelle appears and has dialogue with main characters. Michelle plays a totally insignificant role in this movie, but every time she pops up she's the focus of the shot. Liz is Peter's love interest in the movie, and she doesn't even appear on the official poster. But Michelle does. Why? Her character has barely any screen time, and it seems as though her entire purpose is to be awkward and quirky. So far, we know nothing about her besides her being unfunny and utterly unlikable. Despite bringing the suit with him, Peter almost immediately states that Spider-Man is not a party trick. It is revealed later on that Peter rehearsed lines to say to Liz at the party in character. So he planned on using Spider-Man as a party trick and then changed his mind immediately as he got to the party? Either way, he changes his mind again after being taunted by Bellboy and perches in plain view of everyone at the party with his mask off before leaving to see about a distant explosion. Would Peter have gone through with the showboating if not for the explosion? We'll never know, but Spider-Man's moral compass has never been so broken before. We should be able to tell that he absolutely wouldn't have paraded around in costume regardless of external influences. There's a weapons deal going down and Childish Gambino is present. Peter asks the goon to shoot at him before disarming him, despite his aim being perfect enough for him to have disarmed the goon while they were aiming at Gambino. Peter's telling the goon to shoot at him serves no purpose to the plot. Remember this for later. Peter nearly dies but is rescued by an automated Iron Man suit. This is not the only time Peter gets bailed out of serious trouble by Tony. This means that Tony is, at any given time, keeping tabs on Peter in order to keep him safe or help him. Tony even knows about the churro lady despite Peter having texted happy about that, not Tony. Peter doesn't notice this inconsistency and sulks his way to a piece of alien tech when Ned calls him to tell him not to show his face at the party again. Toombs does the whole villain kills lackey cliché to help relate to the audience that he is the villain, even though he repeatedly proves to be an empathetic antagonist, unlike Killmonger. How will Peter Parker, the nerd, the geek, the tech guru, try to better understand this strange piece of potentially dangerous technology? Peter comes to the conclusion that whoever made this gadget is obviously combining alien tech with human tech because Ned compares a piece of it to his toothbrush charger. When he says inductive charging plate, what the hell is he pointing at? Nothing in line with his finger looks like a charging plate of any kind. Did they just tell Ned's actor to point at thin air and then CGI in an alien gadget forgetting to include a charging plate in its design? Peter mentions vibranium while answering a practice question on the way to Washington. So, depending on the context of this question, people outside of Wakanda either know about vibranium, or at the very least know of its existence. Tony Stark's Spider-Man suit is vulnerable to hacking by a high schooler. Peter learns that his new suit has its own AI, which he later names Karen. The gas station scene is all about Peter learning how complicated his new suit really is. This scene also acts as comic relief as Karen and Peter have humorous back and forth while Peter fumbles around the web shooter controls. First of all, Peter would never have fallen on his face and fumbled around the controls if he had a normal suit, the type of suit Peter would have made in his garage by himself. Second, Peter spends a good few minutes fumbling while Karen explains that his web shooters have 576 possible combinations. He experiences rapid fire and taser web, but clearly just wants his normal projectile webs from which he can swing. So why doesn't he say that? For the entirety of the time Peter spends fumbling about, there is a heist about to go down. His suit responds to his every command, and somehow asking Karen for standard or normal webs doesn't come to mind. And then he tells Karen to choose for him. This royally screws him over when he tries to web up Vulture, and then, finally, during the heat of combat at the worst possible time, he tells Karen to set everything back to normal. This Peter Parker is probably the stupidest of any adaptation. Karen responds with activating all systems, as if that is anything like what Peter asked of her. This confusion is clearly done for comedic effect, but is just frustrating when you try to form objective criticism of this scene. Peter passes the time in the vault by learning some of the new tricks that his suit has, and pours his heart out to Karen. 37 minutes pass before he decides he needs to get out. He checks the loot the Vulture was going to steal, and Karen tells him that the glowy gadget that he and Ned toyed with is actually an explosive. This prompts Peter to try to escape in order to save his friends. Does the decathlon no longer matter to him? Sure, a bomb is a better reason to mobilize than the decathlon, but participating in the decathlon is the essential part of Peter balancing his two lives. Why is Spider-Tom not concerned with keeping up appearances? The Vulture got away, but Peter foiled the heist. Congrats. Now he has another life he has to attend to, and he appears indifferent. By the time Peter starts trying to hack the vault's lock, it's already morning and the team is heading out for the decathlon. Peter could have saved 37 minutes and likely avoided the situation in the Washington Monument if he had any interest in attending the decathlon. He only got stuck in the vault in the first place because he was too stupid to figure out his web shooter's controls as soon as possible. These stakes are manufactured and unnecessary. Ned inexplicably has the bomb with him. The bomb needed to be exposed to radiation to be armed. It goes through the X-ray machine, arming it. Why would Ned even have brought it with them? Peter's suit has X-ray vision. Would that have been enough to arm it? So, a New York decathlon team takes a trip to Washington, D.C., and for the entire time that Peter Parker is absent from that team, Spider-Man, a New York-based hero, is active in DC, and no one in this world can put two and two together. When DC police tell Spidey to identify himself, instead of shouting something that might convince the cops not to shoot at him, he blurts out, "My friends are in there, stop," increasing the chances of his secret identity getting blown. Honestly, Spider-Tom is just an idiot. The wingsuit, the Brooklyn accent, and the daring rescue are fantastic. Homecoming doesn't contain much outright action, but what is there is thoroughly enjoyable. As the elevator drops for the last time, Spidey calls out for Liz. Does no one find it odd that Spider-Man somehow knows this high school student's name? Toombs sees that Spidey saved his daughter on TV and is visibly awestruck. The first piece of foreshadowing that we get for the plot twist. Mr. Harrington's line about not losing another student on a trip is definitely not a throwaway line. I have nothing to base this on other than Marvel being absolutely on point with their Easter egg placement. Despite what the fanbase says about this just being a joke, I believe it's an Easter egg that will get more light shed on it as more movies release. Peter decides to preemptively bunk school because he expects to be moved upstate with the other Avengers. This is not a Peter Parker move in any way. Again, balancing his two lives is Peter's ultimate goal. But here he's totally fine sacrificing his academic responsibilities because he expects everything to work out fine in the end. Which it does. Captain America's cameos are great. Peter has stolen school property and hidden it under the school lockers. Are there no hallway cameras? During the interrogation scene, Gambino mentions that it was ballsy of Peter to have told the goons to shoot at him instead. So, was that the only reason he said that line? To gain Gambino's favor in this scene? Doubtful, because Gambino states right after that he doesn't want that kind of weaponry in the same neighborhood as his nephew, who is Miles Morales, just by the way. So, Peter telling the goon to aim at him still has no purpose. Peter goes to the Staten Island ferry to bust the next weapons deal between Toombs and Mac Gargan. Tony calls and Peter lies to him some more. Tony clearly cares a lot about Peter, keeping track of goings-on in his life and calling him when he damn well knows what Peter's doing. Spidey busts the deal and shows off in true Spider-Man style. He proves to be quite effective with all the new tricks his web shooters can do, including the split web, taser web, and web grenade. Vulture outright says, "You're messing with things you don't understand." one of the truest quotes in the whole movie. Peter repeatedly messes around, often not taking things as seriously as he should, and only seems to learn his lesson after all of these people nearly die. Peter webs up the ferry as it's splitting in half, but stops once he's done one run across the ferry. He's dealing with hundreds of lives, but seems content with just doing enough. I'd try another run, webbing up any points that aren't already webbed up just to be safe. Tony's right to berate Peter for nearly killing hundreds of people, but should also tell him to put his damn mask on. Tony tells Peter that he called the FBI to the ferry, but should have communicated that much earlier. If Peter knew that Tony and the FBI would be involved, things would have turned out much differently. None of this would have happened if Tony had just informed Peter. What's the point of not telling him? To test him? He ends up taking the suit away anyway, so it clearly wasn't a test. This one is on Tony. He goes off on Peter, and if you trust the narrative the movie communicates to us, then it's totally warranted. But if you consider that if Tony and Peter just communicated better, all of the panic could have been avoided, then Tony is being needlessly hostile here. He is unjustified in taking the suit away because this whole debacle was not only Peter's fault. Peter says that he is nothing without the suit in an attempt to keep it. This belief would not have arisen if the suit wasn't handed to him and if he hadn't hacked it. Peter comes home to a disgruntled Aunt May who tells him to cut the bullshit. Their conversation goes something like this. I know you engage in dishonest behavior on a regular basis. I lost my job. Oh, don't worry, it'll all be alright. Peter in no way answers May's questions. May has every right to worry. She presumably just lost her husband a few months ago and only has Peter left. Even Peter's principal gives him a pass because he's a good kid. Does Peter ever have to face up to the consequences of his actions? Tony has given him the most shit so far, and it was mostly unjustified.
You're terrible at keeping secrets.
Yeah, you'd be surprised.
In a moment of unparalleled self-awareness, the movie actually acknowledges just how bad Peter is at keeping secrets, and yet his secret identity is somehow still a mystery. Liz has supposedly forgiven Peter for bunking the decathlon because she nearly died, despite those events being totally unrelated other than both taking place in Washington. If Karen had been able to ID Toombs on the ferry, then this plot twist could have been avoided completely. Regardless, this is one of the best plot twists in the MCU, neck and neck with the twist in Guardians 2. Toombs claims that I'm not old enough to drink is the right answer despite many teenagers drinking while underage. The tension in this scene is possibly the best in any MCU film. This twist secures the Vulture as one of the best MCU villains. He is truly empathetic and relatable. He loves his family and would kill for them. During the car ride, Liz mentions out loud that Peter got to meet Spider-Man. She wouldn't have known this if Ned hadn't mentioned it in gym class, meaning that that stupid scene has two payoffs. Ultimately, the whole purpose of Ned blurting out that Peter knows Spider-Man was to tip off Toombs to Peter's secret identity in this scene. Action, consequence, although extremely convenient. The entire conversation that makes Toombs increasingly suspicious only takes place because of Ned's brain fart. Toombs' convo with Peter is intense. Toombs proves to be fair, intimidating, and empathetic. He is not evil. He does criminal things in order to support his family, which he loves dearly. He spares Peter on the condition that he forgets what happened in the car and doesn't interfere with his business again. Toombs promises to kill Peter and everyone he's ever loved. Not because Toombs is evil or has a grudge against Spider-Man, but because he loves his family. The decision that Peter makes at the homecoming dance, to leave one of the most important nights of his teenage life in order to stop a supervillain, is his greatest test of character in the entire movie. Leaving his phone in Toombs' car was a genius move and proves that Peter's mind was made up with little hesitation. Classic Spider-Man. Then Peter steals Flash's car. This could have been any innocent character, but because it was Flash, all the damage done is justified because of how poorly Flash treated Peter earlier on. And Ned becomes the guy in the chair. Pretty much his entire character arc. As Peter fights for dear life under tons of rubble, we get a reference to one of his most iconic moments in Spider-Man history. He has to summon all of his strength to lift the debris and prove that he is more than his suit, more than his image, a hero capable of fighting for himself. Peter is totally out of his depth, miles above New York, taking on a villain who knows him personally and could ruin his life. Classic Spider-Man. We learn that the high-altitude vacuum seal is an upgrade to Vulture's wings that allows him to board Stark's plane from the outside. Their tech is so powerful that it can fool Happy into believing that the plane is on its way while Toombs makes off with the plane and everything inside it. Why is nobody actually on the plane to safeguard all that valuable tech from a situation exactly like this one? Why is Stark Tech vulnerable to hacking from some repo guys and a goofy high schooler? Peter then drops an engine from the plane, completely indifferent to any of the civilians below him. The plane crashes on a beach, luckily avoiding any civilians and most private property. Toombs is desperate to have something to show and so risks his life to try and steal a crate of arc reactors. Peter saves him in spite of all his misdeeds. Classic Spider-Man. In return for saving his and his daughter's life, and sparing him possibly, Toombs does not rat out Peter later on. Peter spends way too much time with his mask off. Liz and her mom are moving to Oregon following Vulture's incarceration. One could argue that Peter's actions as Spider-Man have now led to consequences in his personal life. But losing a crush who's probably tired of his bullshit by now is far from the worst thing that could have happened. Alternatively, if Liz had stayed in New York and continued a relationship with Peter, then he would have to face the fact that he sent his girlfriend's dad to prison every time he sees her. That would be true consequence. Happy chooses the most awkward place in the school to meet Peter when outside the school could have worked just as well. Peter Parker meeting with an adult in the school bathroom who mentions Tony Stark by name only adds to Peter's suspicious nature. Let's make a tally of all the reasons people have to be suspicious of Peter Parker at this point in the movie. He quit his extracurricular activities right around the time the supposed Stark internship started. In the gym, he goes as far as to say he's met Spider-Man and Ned claims that they're friends, but nobody bats an eye and Flash mocks Peter some more. He bashes a high-tech explosive with a hammer and experiments with web fluid in plain view of his classmates. Both this high school debate team and Spider-Man are from New York. They both appear in Washington at the same time that Peter Parker is nowhere to be found. As Spider-Man, Peter outright calls the debate team his friends to the DC police and calls Liz by name despite not supposing to know her. Peter ditches the homecoming dance the same night that Spider-Man crashes a plane onto a beach, but nobody puts the pieces together. And to top off this list would be every time Peter doesn't have his damn mask on. Tony acts as if his decision to take away Peter's suit was just what he needed and rubs his nose in what was mostly Tony's fault again. Tony's response to Peter's taking down the Vulture is to make him an official Avenger and give him a brand new suit. Is this bribery to account for the fact that Tony didn't tell Peter about the FBI earlier on? And the cherry on top of this plot summary is that May finds out that Peter is Spider-Man because he is truly that bad at keeping his secret identity a secret.
Villains on the rise and the city's victimized, looking up with no surprise, arriving in the speed of time.
Spider-Man is one of the most iconic superheroes in fiction history and is loved by fans of comics, film, and television alike. Not only is Spider-Man's identity and iconography popular, but having spent the past 5 decades in the public domain means people are familiar with his philosophy as well. We all know how the quote goes, but what many people miss is the fundamental meaning and burden of that quote. So, having great power means that you must use it responsibly. Simple enough. Wrong. On the surface, the quote seems simple enough, so we think we understand what it means. But it's this quote, this philosophy, this ethos that invades every aspect of Peter Parker's life and defines every action he makes. You might think that using the motif of power and responsibility would get old after 3 movies, but it cannot be emphasized enough just how versatile that message is. You can apply it to fighting crime, helping those in need, trying to keep a job, or just trying to improve yourself. Those are mostly Spidey-esque things, but you could apply it to just about anything in anyone's personal life. That's always been, and always will be, the quintessential aspect of Peter Parker. He's relatable. Or at least, he should be. Tom Holland's portrayal of Peter Parker has its merits, but ultimately it just doesn't hit the mark. I mentioned that Spider-Man has been around for decades for a reason. Spider-Man does not start and end with Tom Holland. We have decades of reference, countless comic book issues, TV and movie adaptations, and a few great games. We even have a good idea what version of Spider-Man each of the movies are mostly based on. The Raimi trilogy drew inspiration from Spidey's 90s cartoon. Both of these adaptations depict a square-jawed, varsity-going Peter with relatively serious tones. The Amazing Spider-Man films drew inspiration from Spidey's comics at large, borrowing things like Gwen Stacy's death and Peter's parents being secret agents from Earth 616's continuity, while also incorporating the Ultimate Universe's version of Electro. The MCU Spider-Man was said to be inspired by the Spectacular Spider-Man. The cartoon of the same name is more popular, but I'm sure they intended to base the newest version of the webhead off of the comics as well. Spider-Man has been around for decades. He's had dozens of incarnations across many different mediums and alternate universes. It is for this reason that there is nothing wrong comparing one Spider-Man to another, especially considering some versions are far better than others. When I heard that the MCU's Spidey would be based on my single favorite iteration of Spider-Man in all of fiction, I was ecstatic. 2 movies later, and I'm here to report that I am disappointed. Spider-Man Homecoming is not a good Spider-Man film, it does not contain a good Spider-Man or a good Peter Parker. Spider-Tom has been praised for being the best version of Peter Parker on the silver screen in movie history, and I even agreed with the sentiment for a while. But while scripting this critique, I noticed some glaring issues that have flipped my perspective completely. I am now totally convinced that this Peter Parker is an emotionally manipulative, reckless, plot-armored, sad excuse of a John Hughes character. Let me explain. One of Spider-Man's defining characteristics is responsibility. It's 50% of the quote and everything. So how does Spider-Tom go around handling his responsibilities? He doesn't, for the most part. To be fair, Spider-Tom does the right thing on many occasions. For instance, while at Liz's party, Peter sees an explosion and chooses to investigate over showing off to the girl he likes. Classic Spider-Man trope, choosing responsibility over his personal life. This happens again when Peter sees Liz engaging in a rebellious group activity before the decathlon. He recognizes that Liz is emotionally invested in the decathlon and knows that participating would make her happy, but chooses the mission anyway. Peter sacrificing his personal life for his greater responsibilities. Classic Spider-Man. On the night of the homecoming dance, Peter chooses to take on the Vulture with no high-tech suit or potential help from Tony. Classic Spider-Man. Although Spider-Tom embodies the spider spirit in these instances, the amount of time he spends being irresponsible and reckless vastly outweighs his good deeds. In gym class, the coach sees how well Peter's doing sit-ups and compliments him, so Peter begins to pretend struggle. This is a key aspect of Spider-Man's spirit to which he should be more attuned. Spider-Tom even recognizes how he needs to balance his dual identity in Civil War.
And yeah, I would love to play football. But I couldn't then, so I shouldn't now.
Did he just forget that quote completely? His Spider-Man suit is handed to him, instead of him crafting it himself. Once he gets Ned to hack it for him, he learns about a whole new batch of tricks it has, none of which he earned the right to use. He repeatedly lies to Tony Stark, his mentor, the one who handed him the suit on a silver platter in the first place. Peter has no problem using his powers in broad daylight just as he gets out of school. He gets changed into his costume in an alleyway in plain view of passing cars and pedestrians. His poor choice of location to change is the whole reason Ned discovers he's Spider-Man. He sees a bank robbery in progress and says, "Finally, something good." Spider-Man is not one to revel in crimes being committed, no matter how bored he may be. His goofs and quips directly lead to Mr. Delmar's shop getting destroyed, and yet he feels no guilt for this. Would the owner have had to die for Peter to take some responsibility here? The next morning he shows no signs of guilt despite his goofing costing Mr. Delmar's livelihood. As Spider-Tom chases the Vulture goons, he destroys private property like it's nothing to him. Peter gets out of serious punishment after bunking detention because he's a good kid. And he gets welcomed back onto the debate team after pitching last minute. Of course they accept him back because he's a star debater, and so he never has to face the consequences of his actions. The one consequence he does have to face, however, is that he is terrible at secret keeping. Ned, Toomes, and May all learn that Peter is Spider-Man because he sucks at keeping his secret identity secure. And yes, Toomes would not have found out if it wasn't for Ned running his mouth, but Ned wouldn't have found out if Peter didn't leave his backpack in an easily accessible alleyway. Not only is Spider-Tom irresponsible and terrible at keeping his secret identity a secret, he's also a manipulative prick. When Ned is reluctant to hack into the multi-million-dollar suit, Peter emotionally manipulates him by mentioning the guy in the chair trope in which Ned is heavily invested. After the ferry incident, Peter comes home to a worried Aunt May who asks Peter to explain himself. So he sobs about losing the internship, May's maternal instincts kick in, and she forgets about ever asking him to justify his actions. So many actions, so few consequences. This movie stands in stark contrast to the Spectacular Spider-Man series, in which every action of Peter's has an equal and opposite reaction. One of my favorite examples would be the time Peter has to save Doc Connors from his transformation into the Lizard. He leaves the situation as Peter Parker and arrives back as Spider-Man to his close friend's dismay. While this is all happening, he decides to take photos for some bugle money. There is absolutely no chance Peter Parker can come out on top in this situation. He's juggling his friend's opinion of him, the well-being of the Connors family, and his financial situation with regards to helping Aunt May. In the end, Doc Connors gets the cure and Peter gets the credit for the Lizard photos, but because his friends watched him disappear only for his name to appear under the Lizard photo in the Bugle, he gets fired and Eddie immediately resents him. Peter then goes home and seriously considers ridding himself of his powers because of how his double life is affecting him. That's all in one 23-minute long episode. That show is full of actions and consequences. Because the Spectacular Spider-Man understood Spider-Man in a way many iterations of the webhead do too, but in a manner that Homecoming misses all the same. On a fundamental level, Spider-Man is present in Homecoming, but not in full force. Part of him is missing. What makes this awkward situation worse is the way Peter Parker is depicted in Homecoming is something entirely new, a creation and symptom of the MCU. We'll never know what Spider-Tom would have been without Tony's influence, something that Peter Parker only receives late into his time as Spidey in the comics. This Spider-Man is brash, uncaring, and unrelatable. Nothing like the icon we've come to know and love, and certainly nothing like a John Hughes character. Full disclosure, I have seen very few John Hughes films, even fewer that specifically tackle teenhood and are considered coming-of-age films. That is how this movie was marketed. Spider-Man Homecoming, a coming-of-age film in the vein of John Hughes movies. Going off of the relevant movies that I have seen, namely Ferris Bueller's Day Off and The Breakfast Club, I can confidently assert that Homecoming is not a Spider-Man movie or anything John Hughes-esque. There's a very on-the-nose reference to Ferris Bueller's Day Off while Spider-Man is chasing the Vulture Goons. Homecoming is nothing like that movie. Just because they included the reference does not mean the movies are alike. The resemblance between Homecoming and a John Hughes film is the same here as it is in the rest of the movie. Purely superficial. If you haven't seen The Breakfast Club, then be warned I will be drawing comparisons between it and Homecoming. When we talk about John Hughes and coming-of-age films, we're really talking about movies that capture the essence of being a teenager, something that Homecoming set out to do and failed miserably. The Breakfast Club is such a good movie because of the timeless manner in which it comments on teenhood. It's unfiltered. It shows teenagers as they really are, vulgar, horny, naive, and longing for purpose or acceptance. Homecoming is not a coming-of-age story because it is hopelessly unaware of what teenhood is like. This movie's portrayal of teenage life is totally cosmetic. They're at a high school, Peter has a crush, and there's a bully. There's melodrama and a bit of angst, but Homecoming is incapable of being true to the John Hughes mold because of the time at which it released. In this era of inoffensiveness and tolerance above all else, it would be impossible to get a movie like The Breakfast Club off of the ground for fear of Twitter hate mobs and virtue police. What's strangest of all about this is that The Breakfast Club somehow manages to be simultaneously vulgar and lighthearted, fictitious and relatable, offensive and lovable. It pulls from the extremes of the spectrum, rather than taking the safe route down the middle, as Homecoming did. The Breakfast Club has timeless commentary to share on the divide between stereotypes at school and how we can grow as people through introspection. Spider-Man Homecoming communicates to its audience that teenhood is mostly superficial, development of character doesn't need to be organic, and that actions don't have consequences. In summary, Spider-Tom is reckless beyond belief, emotionally manipulative, free from owning up to either of those, and nothing like a John Hughes character. Not only that, but also nothing like Spider-Man. Peter Parker is a guy, whether he's a student in high school or teaching in a high school, who can't catch a break. Everything stands in his way, and just when things appear to be going well for him, life knocks him down even harder than the last time. When does that happen in Homecoming? And more importantly, when does Peter ever truly suffer?
Crawling through the night, facing evil with his might. He's a hero in our eyes, see the headlines every time.
Aunt May walks into the room, undoes her hair, and Ned is visibly in awe. MCU Aunt May is weird in that everyone finds her attractive. This is a dimension that was absent to every other version of her. Sure, she's had relationships with other characters like Jameson and Doc Ock in the comics, but it wasn't like every other guy looked at her as if she was a supermodel. May Googles a Windsor knot tutorial and teaches Peter to dance. Throughout the movie, she proves herself to be hip and cool, another new dimension of May we've never seen before. She shows that she cares about Peter and wants him to be safe, more like the May we know and love. And then she gets free dessert and a wink from a waiter. Peter is clearly aware that people around him find May attractive, but seems comfortable with it anyway. He's definitely had more time to come to terms with it than we have. I'd be much more comfortable with how different her personality is if everyone didn't find her so attractive. Reason being, Aunt May has always been kind of a rock for Peter, a mother figure who he respects and cherishes, and so we, in turn, respect Aunt May as that guiding maternal figure in Peter's life. We all have an Aunt May in our lives, and seeing that character be turned into eye candy feels wrong. It could just be me, but I think that making May quirky and hot detracts from her character, especially as it's been established over the decades. And please, don't think I'm criticizing the movie for needlessly sexualizing what is supposed to be a respectable female character. I don't think I could handle being roasted as an SJW. My problem is not anything to do with female oppression, and I'm not trying to make victims of anyone. It's that Aunt May has traditionally been an innocent, revered, and beloved character because of the important role she plays in Peter's life. She's the only family Peter has left. They both lost Uncle Ben and so are essential in each other's lives. Imagine having every other person make googly eyes at your maternal figure. You might become upset or even defensive. Again, I have no problem with objectified or sexualized characters in fiction. I don't care. Women know when they're objectifying themselves. People who make movies know when they're objectifying their female characters. It's pretty cut and dry. But Aunt May is a pre-established character, one who is extremely well known in fiction. Everyone knows Batman has Alfred. Everyone knows that Ben 10 has a Grandpa Max. Everyone knows that Spider-Man has Aunt May. And they know the archetype of her character, how she behaves and interacts with her world. Changing that isn't necessarily a problem, but the way the MCU did feels wrong. You'd think Marvel would know better than to sexualize the one character who is easily the most present and influential in Peter's life. Marvel is all about empowering minorities and women. This was an odd choice to say the least. Spider-Man Homecoming's main villain is undoubtedly one of the best villains in the MCU. Why? Because he's relatable. A perfect foil to Peter Parker. Having a relatable hero and villain makes for far more compelling content. This is why that scene in which he kills his lackey bugs me. If not for this single scene, Toomes' character is consistent. Every misdeed and crime Toomes commits is in service of his family. That's his drive. He loves his family. And he certainly doesn't kill at a whim or for pleasure. Take a look at everything Toomes does in the movie. Can you justifiably call this character evil? Hell no. He's as empathetic as it gets. Apart from this shoehorned, pointless kill. When we see Peter and Toomes face off at the end of the movie, the context skews our bias in favor of Peter. But don't you think the movie would have been better if we had equal stakes in both these characters, and Peter prevailed because he was doing the right thing, rather than Toomes losing purely because he was doing the wrong thing? We can identify with both these characters. Peter has an obligation to do the right thing, and ultimately shirks off Liz to do just that. But Toomes is just trying to support his family. I'm not going to try to justify his actions, but it is undeniable that his motivations could be just as compelling as Peter's. The plot twist left my jaw dropped and my anticipation sky high. I had no idea what to expect. Toomes' words to Peter in the car ride that followed cemented this character as one of the most compelling and relatable villains in the MCU. Flash has been changed from a jock to a bellboy, but still tries to intimidate Peter. Flash, for some reason, is now a meek-looking Indian who's part of the school debate team. This is a strange character overhaul. What's really important about Flash's character is how he antagonizes Peter. That's always been his defining character trait. The race change was unnecessary and is just an example of forced diversity. This is tokenism, plain and simple. His now being part of the debate team can be forgiven, but hold up.
Thank you. My friends call me MJ.
No. Listen, before any of you call me out for having an ethnic double standard, being okay with Flash's overhaul and not MJ's, let me clarify the difference here. Flash's race was never a defining trait of the character. Mary Jane Watson's race was indirectly essential to her character. MJ has always been a smoking hot redhead who has everybody drooling at the mouth but ultimately chooses Peter as the love of her life. And don't give me that colorblind bullshit suggesting that a black redhead would be no different to a white one. We all know better than that. Flash and Michelle are both examples of forced diversity, and I do not have a double standard when it comes to this. Both of these race changes were unnecessary. That is the standard. But only one of these race changes is egregious. If you're still foggy and consider me a racist at this point, allow me to further clarify. The problem is not that Homecoming features a black love interest for Peter Parker. It's that Homecoming took a well-established white character and needlessly changed her race. That is the definition of forced diversity. Michelle is nothing more than a token black love interest. She is not Mary Jane Watson. She is Mary Jane Watson's diversity hire replacement. And maybe you'd make the argument that because her name isn't Mary Jane, it's a totally different character, and therefore not an example of forced diversity. In that case, they wouldn't need to bank on the iconicity of the MJ nickname. If Michelle were her own original character, then Mary Jane could still exist in the MCU. Tell me, how likely do you think that is?
Making villains fall, webbing rivals to a halt, racing up and down the walls, bringing justice to us all.
Actually, it's Native Americans. Protesting is patriotic. I don't really want to celebrate something that was built by slaves. These are all politically charged statements, and that was the intention of the writers, to include political messagery in order to say something about society, to make some change, to reach the politically conscient, to edify the audience. The first two of these quotes are throwaway lines that I'm not going to worry about because Michelle's line with Mr. Harrington is the real kicker. Mr. Harrington asks Michelle how she's taking in the Washington Monument, to which she replies that she wouldn't like to celebrate something built by slaves. There is so much to dissect here. Firstly, Mr. Harrington's reaction and subsequent surprise at a security guard reaffirming Michelle's claim is nothing short of ridiculous. This man is a high school teacher and is involved with the school's decathlon team. This team is constantly shown to be all about trivia and knowledge, but their teacher is surprised that a 170-year-old statue was built by slaves. The movie plays this up as a gotcha moment as Michelle looks on at her dopey teacher with a shit-eating grin. Homecoming is just full of unbelievable characters. Flash proves to be unintelligent but is on the debate team, Ned is beyond goofy, Michelle is ultra quirky, Aunt May is eye candy, Tony Stark is a hyper jerk, and Mr. Harrington cannot fathom how this American landmark was built by slaves. Suspension of disbelief only goes so far. This is a superhero movie in which a guy in pajamas rides a plane onto an empty beach while fighting an older guy in an alien tech bird suit, and yet I have the most trouble believing how stupid this teacher is. He even walks off as if he's ashamed of himself. The movie appears to show us characters interacting around the Washington Monument and would like us to take home the idea that we've just been educated on relevant political issues. But what the movie actually shows us is an incompetent middle-aged man gets served by a woke youth and so hangs his head in shame. What the movie is really trying to relate to the audience is that if you didn't know that the Washington Monument was built by slaves, then you yourself are ignorant and should hang your head in shame. This is the most blatant way to shove ideology down the audience's throat, by telling them how to think through characters acting in an unbelievable manner. Secondly, Michelle's words go far deeper than she or the writers likely realize. She doesn't want to celebrate anything that was built by slaves. Well, that rules out the Capitol Building, Wall Street, Castillo de San Marcos, Monticello, Mount Vernon, several highly respected universities, and all 4 major railways in the US. But hey, why stop there? Slave labor has been used since the earliest civilizations on the planet and is still exploited today. Look at the buildings in almost any country from the right time frame and you'll find that slavery was totally commonplace. We still have no idea who built the pyramids, but our best guess ruling out aliens would likely involve slave labor. Does that mean we shouldn't celebrate one of the greatest architectural masterpieces in Earth's history? If you don't want to celebrate something just because it was built by slaves, then you are limiting the amount of enjoyment you get out of the world based on circumstances beyond your control. Slavery has been practiced all over the world and ended, for the most part, before our grandparents were even born. There is no good reason we should feel guilt over the actions of a fraction of our ancestors. We can impact the future. We can't change the past. Homecoming would have you believe that if you are ignorant of this landmarks being built by slaves, that you should feel ashamed. This movie would have you conform to the idea of white guilt. Political narratives like this are very popular nowadays and resonate with establishment elites and empowered youths alike. But these political narratives are nothing more than fads, passing trends that come and go like weather. There are many people who feel that they are doing the world a service by sewing radical ideology into fiction in a disingenuous attempt at activism. To all the Michelles out there who would love for white guilt and other political crazes to infest every corner of media and get shoved down the throats of people who would simply like to escape our harsh reality, I urge you to remember that atrocities have been committed on all sides. Western nations engaged in slavery, yes, but they were also some of the first countries to abolish it. The word slave is derived from the Slavic people who were traded as slaves in Venice during the Middle Ages. Slavic people being traditionally white. White guilt is not only unnecessary, it's totally reliant on people believing that white people should be held accountable today for slavery that took place generations ago. Not to mention that slavery is completely legal in certain places today. Depending on how we define slavery, one could argue that it is even more common than that. Marvel clearly sucks at incorporating politics into their work, movies and comics alike. The bottom line here is that fiction would be better off without the inclusion of political and ideological messagery. If our media is going to include activism from now on, could it at least comment on actual world issues? The Marvel Cinematic Universe's timeline has long been debated, and fans have come up with several commonly accepted canonical timelines over the years. And Spider-Man Homecoming shits on every single one of them. One of the most commonly accepted facts of the MCU canon is that the Battle of New York, depicted in the Avengers, takes place in 2012. This means that the opening scene of Homecoming, which shows pre-Vulture Adrian Toomes working to clean up the mess the Avengers left, takes place in 2012. Then a title card takes us 8 years later to what must be present day. Toomes has turned his cleanup operation into an alien tech-powered, kinda different operation, but not too different operation. They steal from damage control and make cool weapons, so they're definitely involved in black market weapons dealing, but I have no idea what else. Either way, this is 8 years after New York, which puts the events of Spider-Man Homecoming firmly in 2020. Not so fast, we actually get another timestamp. The movie then shows us Peter vlogging his trip to Germany and his subsequent tussle with the Avengers. After Tony drops Peter off back at home, the movie cuts to 2 months later, meaning that Spider-Man Homecoming takes place 8 years after the Avengers, but only 2 months after Civil War? What? It can't take place in 2020 and 2016 at the same time. Does Marvel know about this? Did Kevin Feige watch this movie before it premiered? How did this make it past the cutting room? The MCU's timeline isn't perfect, but it was at least semi-sensible before now. So this title card says 8 years, and this time jump says 2 months, but that's not all. About halfway through the movie, Karen pulls up information on Gambino's character, and it clearly states that Aaron Davis, age 33, was born in 1984. That puts this movie squarely in 2017. So let's get the record straight. Spider-Man Homecoming takes place in 2017, 8 years after 2012, and 2 months after Civil War. Spider-Man Homecoming is a cancerous wart of continuity errors. The MCU was better off without its convoluted timekeeping mistakes. The MCU's timeline does not hold up now that Homecoming is a part of it. We, the audience, the fans, will now have to make up for this error. I'm saying this present tense despite other fans already having solved this for the sake of the script. So how does Spider-Man Homecoming fit into the MCU timeline as a whole? For context's sake, I'm going to cover the actual timeline itself. This way, my criticism makes more sense than if I just spoke about the timeline with only regards to Homecoming. Keep in mind, I will only be referring to the MCU movies for the sake of convenience and because some of Marvel's other material contradicts what the movies state. This means no Agent Carter, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., or Defenders will be included in this discussion. The two most popular and sensible timelines that fans have come up with so far go something like this. Timeline A sees Iron Man 1 and the Incredible Hulk take place in 2008. Iron Man 2 takes place in 2010. Thor and Captain America Waking Up takes place in 2011. The Avengers takes place in 2012. Iron Man 3 and Thor the Dark World takes place in 2013. Captain America the Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 and 2 takes place in 2014. Now, if you aren't sure why Guardians 2 takes place in the same year as Guardians 1, director James Gunn stated that Guardians 2 takes place 3 months after Guardians 1. This makes sense because at the end of Guardians 1, Groot is a little STEM baby, and at the beginning of Guardians 2, Groot is baby Groot. But the post-credits scene of Guardians 2 sees an older, teenage Groot. And it has been confirmed that the events of this post-credit scene take place a few years after the events of the movie, putting it closer to Infinity War. Now that that's cleared up, Age of Ultron and Ant-Man take place in 2015, Civil War and Doctor Strange take place in 2016, Ragnarok and Homecoming take place in 2017, and Black Panther, Infinity War, and Ant-Man and the Wasp take place in 2018. Can you spot the problem with this timeline? If you don't want me to spoil it for you, then pause the video and see if you can figure it out. 3, 2, 1. The problem with Timeline A is that it assumes that the events of each MCU movie take place around the release date of that same movie, excluding Guardians 2. This is the timeline and rule of thumb that I've stuck with over the years, and it's never given me problems. Until Homecoming. Timeline A works quite well because in-universe dates put the events of these movies in the same year or sometimes the same week as their release date. This timeline becomes a problem when you take into account the very early and very late movies in the order. Timeline A claims that the events of Iron Man 1 and The Incredible Hulk happen in the same year, despite it being possible that Hulk takes place much closer to Iron Man 2 because of news footage shown at the end of the movie. However, it is possible that that footage is old and only being used to make a point. Timeline A also claims that the events of Thor take place 1 year after Iron Man 2, despite the post-credits scene, which could have just been a teaser looking into the future, and a scene in which Nick Fury alludes to a greater universe. This universe quote could also be referring to the Hulk, more evidence that the events of Iron Man 2, the Hulk, and Thor take place much closer to each other than their release dates would have us believe. Then, if we look at the later movies in the timeline, it claims that Black Panther takes place 2 years after Civil War, despite a news broadcast placing Black Panther no more than a week after Civil War. This is not old news footage that T'Challa is watching out of mourning, because he and Okoye are currently en route to pick up Nakia for T'Challa's coronation ceremony. Even though Nakia is undercover and has no access to news media, this taking place a whole 2 years after Civil War doesn't pan out. Why would T'Challa wait that long to return home? What would he have done in that time while Wakanda had no king? All the evidence puts Black Panther 1 week after Civil War in 2016. While this timeline is widely accepted because it's very convenient for the audience, it doesn't hold up under light scrutiny. We need a better timeline. This is likely what led fans to create a new and improved timeline which takes into account in-movie dates and times, but also requires a bit more concentration from the audience. Timeline B sees the events of Iron Man taking place in 2008, Iron Man 2, Thor, Incredible Hulk, and Captain America Waking Up take place in 2009, The Avengers takes place in 2010, Iron Man 3 takes place in 2013, Thor the Dark World, The Winter Soldier, Guardians 1 and 2 takes place in 2014, Age of Ultron and Ant-Man take place in 2015, Doctor Strange takes place in 2016, and Civil War, Black Panther, Homecoming, and Thor Ragnarok take place in 2017. Keep in mind, this timeline was created before Infinity War and so doesn't take into account new info. Timeline B places the events of Thor, Hulk, and Iron Man 2 much closer together, which works just fine in canon. Timeline B moves the Avengers a whole 2 years back, likely to accommodate Homecoming. This wouldn't be much of a problem if it wasn't for the placement of Iron Man 3. Placing Iron Man 3 3 years after the events of Avengers is problematic. In Iron Man 3, Tony is suffering from PTSD from the Battle of New York. It's unlikely that he would have been suffering for so long, but this time gap does give him more than enough time to have built those 40+ new suits. Timeline B was, for the most part, created to rectify the continuity error created in Homecoming, and it does just that. Putting Homecoming in 2017 means that the Battle of New York took place about 7 years before, and so if you don't mind rounding up, the title card now makes sense. This timeline also places Black Panther and Homecoming in the same year as Civil War, meaning that continuity is kept and the errors are solved. Almost. In Civil War, Vision states that 8 years have passed since Tony became Iron Man. This time gap makes more sense within the context of Timeline A, but if we need to round up some more for this to make sense, then it's no big deal. The problem with Timeline B is that it was created to rectify the problem introduced in Homecoming, and so incorporates an error into the MCU timeline, effectively messing up the order of things as of Avengers Infinity War. Tony states that Thanos has been in his head for 6 years. This quote makes sense according to Timeline A, but remember that one's already been debunked. Infinity War takes place almost immediately after Thor Ragnarok, and so takes place at the earliest, 2017. Tony's been suffering from Thanos-induced trauma ever since the Battle of New York, which according to this timeline happened 7 years ago, possibly even 8. What's going on? Why is the MCU's continuity so screwed up? It's because of this. This one movie threw a wrench in the works of what was a perfectly good timeline. What does Marvel think of any of this? Have they even responded? Why yes, they have. And they admit they screwed the pooch on this one. They messed up. The 8 years title card is false. It is a filthy lie. And how do you think they approached fixing this timeline? By making it even more confusing and not actually fixing anything. Marvel released their very own official MCU timeline and it doesn't help at all. This timeline was not created out of passion, but out of a need to appease frustrated fans. They admitted the title card in Homecoming is wrong and have corrected the time jump to 4 years. A massive difference, but it supposedly works in this new context. Only, this timeline is just as messed up as any of the others. Moving Iron Man to 2010 is totally unnecessary and it makes Vision's line in Civil War totally wrong. Putting Black Panther a year apart from Civil War contradicts information in Black Panther.
The beloved ruler was one of many confirmed dead after a terrorist attack at the United Nations a week ago.
Unless that time jump happened over New Year's, the people over at Marvel have their heads up their asses. In Infinity War, it is stated that Cap, Widow, Witch, and Falcon have been on the run for a couple years, meaning at least 2. But this timeline not only puts Infinity War in 2017, it puts Civil War in late December of 2016 to account for Black Panther taking place 1 week later, but also the next year. Congrats Marvel, you didn't help anything in any way at all. In response to all this negative criticism, I'd like to offer a helping hand. My own continuity. My version of the MCU timeline. I have no authority, so none of this is official, but I don't like the state of the timeline at the moment, and I believe I can offer a logical timeline of events that puts the MCU's movies in context without confusing any more viewers. My timeline goes like this. Iron Man takes place in 2008. Iron Man 2, The Incredible Hulk, Thor, and Captain America Waking Up take place sometime between 2010 and 2011. The Avengers takes place in 2012, and Iron Man 3 takes place on Christmas either 2012 or 2013. Thor: The Dark World takes place sometime between 2013 and 2014. The Winter Soldier, Guardians 1 and 2 take place in 2014, and Age of Ultron and Ant-Man take place in 2015. Civil War, Black Panther, and Homecoming all take place in 2016. Doctor Strange takes place from 2016 through 2017, and Thor Ragnarok takes place between 2017 and 2018 to account for how time passes on Sakaar. And lastly, Infinity War and Ant-Man and the Wasp take place in 2018. The point of this timeline is to fit the movies comfortably into the MCU canon as to avoid contradictions and ultimately make sense. The goal is not to be precise, but sensible. With this timeline, in-universe dates and quotes make sense. Nick Fury has a lot on his plate around 2010 to 2011. Tony has been Iron Man for 8 years as of Civil War. Thanos has been in Tony's head for 6 years as of Infinity War. Civil War takes place a week before Black Panther, 2 months before Homecoming, and a couple years before Infinity War. The only movie with time references that don't add up is Homecoming, because, as we know, the movie sucks at timekeeping. I give to you a timeline that makes sense.
Spectacular, 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 spectacular.
The 16th edition to the MCU brings with it an incredible villain, a host of continuity errors, and what is arguably the worst big-screen Peter Parker we've ever seen. Spider-Tom is irresponsible, incompetent, borderline brain-dead, and inexplicably free of consequence. I, like many Marvel fans, had high hopes of the MCU Spider-Man, but was left disappointed all the same. However, the damage done to the spirit and icon of Spider-Man is not beyond repair. Far From Home could redeem Spider-Tom of all the problems Homecoming brought forth. I'm not saying it'd be easy, but I have not lost hope for this version of Spidey, and at the end of the day, I want to see Marvel succeed at accurately and authentically bringing these heroes from the pages of comics to the silver screen. I want to enjoy Spider-Tom as much as I have Captain America and Doctor Strange. I don't want Marvel to keep screwing over their great characters with the unnecessary inclusion of politics. I want Captain Marvel to be a fantastic film, but the way the MCU is going, I think Endgame will be Marvel's last truly great movie for a while. Regardless, I'll keep hoping for enjoyable, sensible movies, and I'll keep criticizing Marvel for their shortcomings. Considering the critical acclaim superhero movies have achieved over the years, we should hold Marvel to the same standards. It's only a matter of time before they stop releasing films on the level of Black Panther and finally give us something to put the Dark Knight to shame. Until then, I'll keep griping and hopefully you keep watching. See you next time.